In the early morning hours, just before dawn, on August the 19th, 1976, a truck driver named Martin Durant had been either working a long shift and on his way home, or he had been on his way to work. It really depends on which report you're reading. He drove up to a frontage road called Locklear in Sumter County, South Carolina. Well, Martin came across something he wasn't quite expecting. Well, howdy, y'all. Today I got a pretty wild story for you. This story is kind of like getting a box of puzzles without a label or anything on it, opening them up, and you only have half the pieces. And when you put all the pieces together that you know you have, it just doesn't make any sense. Just doesn't make any sense. And today I'm sitting here with my good pal, Parrot the dog. He's actually our house investigator here. If you need to know anything about any case, he'll figure it out for you. And just what surprise was waiting for Mr. Durant? Well, 2 dead bodies in a shallow ditch, of course. Again, depending on what report you're reading, either radioed a local store or had driven to the local store and asked somebody there to get a hold of the authorities for him. So during these times was long before people had things like the cell phone, so you couldn't just call 911. Our story was actually eclipsed by Hurricane Belle. Around this time, there was evacuation warnings along the coastline all the way from South Carolina to New England. Ultimately, the storm did hit further north and did cause about $100 million worth of damage. The hurricane actually hit the day after our couple was found. So before we go any further, I do want to let you know that this is a really old case. Some of the media reports might have been prone to a bit of hyperbole. Maybe rumors got thrown in. People started to believe some things that probably were not true. I do want to let you know that. And when the police did arrive, they did have a surprise waiting for them. They came across 2 bodies, both lying face up, shot 3 times each with a .357 Magnum pistol. There was 1 woman and 1 man. Both appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. Later it was determined the man was probably as old as 30 years old. The man was just over 6 feet tall and weighed about 150 pounds. He was described as having thick, bushy eyebrows and shoulder-length brown hair. He had a very nice gold Bulova watch and a gold star sapphire ring with the initials on the inside that said JPF, and a book of matches with Grant's Truck Shop inscribed on it. He was wearing a pair of faded blue jeans and a red shirt that said Coors, America's Beer. And on the back it had a promotion for an ISMA race that took place in March the year before. He had a few different scars on his shoulders and backs, which were common with people who played contact sports. He also had a very unusual type of root canal that was believed that may have been performed in Europe, maybe. And even though his teeth were nice, the work on them was only partially done because of the rather expensive watch and ring and the unique dental work that our John Doe had. It was thought that he came from a higher socioeconomic background. So the woman, she was about 5'5". She weighed about 100 to 110 pounds. So she also wore a pair of Daisy Dukes, or at least that's what they would call them today, pink halter top with a white blouse over the top. And both victims were clean and well groomed. It didn't seem like they were transients or hitchhikers. Hitchhikers would be a little dirtier than these guys were. The woman didn't shave her legs, and neither victims had underwear on. And there's been a lot made about this, but you gotta remember, this is just after the hippie days begun. I don't believe this was that unusual or weird, so I think people are making more out to it than it really is. Authorities also believed, for some reason, that the 2 may have been siblings, though later it was determined they were not, through DNA. Also, another interesting thing is that the male didn't have shoes on, and the female actually had these wedge-type shoes on. Overall, though, the scene, it looked like an execution. Just straight up, looked like an execution. The bodies were taken to the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston for an autopsy. And afterwards, they actually put them in see-through caskets, which is kind of crazy. I never heard of this kind of thing before. Actually, about 30 people went and tried to ID them, but nobody ever claimed them. So after a year, they were buried at the Bethel United Methodist Cemetery in Oswego. There was also a witness that was been described as a hermit, which is kind of odd. Early reports describe it just as a resident who lived nearby. These are one of those things I think that rumors got a hold of, maybe because he didn't report it immediately after hearing it. There's no telling. But according to this witness, he heard shots in the middle of the night and then heard a vehicle sped off real quick. There's another version of the story that said the hermit actually witnessed this, but I highly doubt that's actually true. It wasn't too long, about a couple months or so, before a man called a lieutenant with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, otherwise known as SLED. The man, whose name was David Batson, said that he and his wife managed a KOA campground near Santee, South Carolina, which was about an hour from our crime scene. Mr. Batson claimed that our John Doe had stayed at his campground on the way to Florida and on the way back. They had even spent some time hanging out and playing pool, so David got to know the John Doe just a little bit. David claimed that John Doe called himself Jacque, said he was from Canada. He said he was a son of a prominent doctor, and his family disowned him because instead of going in the medical field, he decided to become a teacher instead. Mr. Batson had also recognized the ring and had said that Jacque Doe had actually apparently offered to sell him that ring because he liked it so much. The only thing about our Jane Doe that Mr. Batson indicated is that he was Jacque Doe's girlfriend, and that was about it. So unfortunately, this report was just filed away, and it was never followed up until 10 years later. 10 years later, a coroner deputy was looking over the records. She tried to do a follow-up, but unfortunately, Mr. Batson had passed away, and the records that the campground kept was in a house that had been burned down. So a lot of people assumed because the man said he was from Canada and his name was Jacque, that his actual name might have been Jacques instead of Jock. And a lot of leads were followed up with this guy possibly being from Canada, and of course nothing ever panned out. A lot of resources were wasted, a lot of time was wasted, and nothing happened. And then a couple months later, a truck driver by the name of Lonnie George Henry Sr. was pulled over and arrested for driving while intoxicated in Latta, South Carolina, which is about a 45-minute drive away from our execution scene. And it was during this search that a .357 Magnum was found. That's interesting. Isn't that the kind of weapon that killed our couple? Yes, it is. They did some ballistics testing, and it turned out to be the exact same weapon that killed our couple. So they dragged Lonnie George Henry Sr. back into the interrogation room. They had a few more questions for him. I've got to make this clear. There is a Lonnie Jr. and a Lonnie Sr., and the Lonnie Henry we're talking about is Lonnie Henry Sr. Lonnie did have a reputation with getting into trouble with the law, though nothing quite as serious as a murder. It appeared that the gun's serial number was filed down, and you can't really get away with that these days. They have tests that can bring out the serial number, even if you try to file it off. So when they looked up the serial number for this firearm, they found out that it actually been purchased by Lonnie's brother a few years before. So they interviewed Lonnie's brother, and Lonnie's brother had stated that he had given Lonnie the weapon a few years after he bought it, and the serial number was indeed intact. When Lonnie Sr. was confronted with this information, "Hey bro, what's going on, man? You got the murder weapon. Tell me what's going on." He did confess filing the serial number off, but he still maintained that he had nothing to do with the murder. He said that he had actually been in North Carolina at a hospital with his ailing wife, Lonnie. He had some family members that vouched for him. And oddly enough, the police did let him go, citing that they did not have enough evidence. This seems a little strange to me. This seems like a lead that should have been looked into a lot harder. And I personally believe, along with many other people, that Lonnie Sr. had something to do with his murder. Even if he didn't commit the murder himself, he knew who had access to that weapon. He knew. It's also interesting to note that before the Henrys ever took possession of his firearm, it was actually involved in a burglary. It was a stolen weapon and a burglary. Crazy, right? Eventually, a mechanic from Nebraska came forward saying that he had actually done work on the couple's van. He couldn't recall what type of work he'd done or the make and model of the van, but he did recall that the vehicle had either Oregon or Washington plates on it. The dental records of the male was eventually sent off and published in the Journal of American Dental Association, hoping that some dentist would actually recognize their unique handiwork. But unfortunately, this didn't lead anywhere either. So skip ahead many years, all the way to 2007. And in 2007, both their bodies were exhumed. Their DNA was pulled, and it was determined that they were not siblings, as had been previously believed. In the summer of 2019, the DNA Doe Project became involved with the case. The tenets of the DNA Doe Project, according to its website, is an exciting new initiative that uses genetic genealogy to identify Jane and John Does. They have become the go-to organization for law enforcement agencies and medical examiners all across the country. On January the 21st, 2021, the Sumter County Sheriff's Department had announced that they had indeed confirmed the identity of Jane and Jacque Doe.
Start off tonight with a nearly 45-year-old mystery. We now know the names of a man and woman who were found shot to death off of I-95 in Sumter County in the summer of 1976. Investigators made the announcement today. Alicia Nieves was there. She joins us now live with the latest. Alicia.
Darcy, all these years later, these families are one step closer to getting closure. Although this couple has been identified, this case still remains unsolved because their killer hasn't been found. Today, Sumter County Sheriff Anthony Dennis identified the couple as 25-year-old Pamela Buckley from Colorado Springs and 30-year-old James Freund from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Their bodies were found August 9, 1976 by a truck driver on Old St. John Church Road in Lynchburg. Investigators say both were shot multiple times and the couple carried no identification. Authorities tried to find an ID by circulating their photos nationwide at the time. In 2007, their bodies were exhumed to get a DNA sample. Those were sent to the DNA Doe Project in Texas in 2019 and to other spots in California and Alabama to confirm their identities.
And there still are some persons of interest in this case on committing the homicide. I have and will officially open the investigation again into the homicides of both of the victims.
I hope that there's somebody out there in the United States that comes with a guilty conscience, has some memory of these two individuals, maybe an acquaintance, maybe they might have seen them somewhere at a truck stop somewhere. Hopefully this will trigger somebody's memory or either trigger a guilty conscience to come forward and contact the Sheriff's Department so that they can help solve.
The local authorities gave most of the credit for solving the case to a local named Matthew McDaniels. McDaniels was an amateur sleuth who studied this case for quite a while before connecting the county sheriff's department with the DNA Doe Project.
Now, an upstate man who helped with the DNA testing in this case also helped solve a missing persons case in 2019.
And this is unprecedented that two people are murdered and never identified.
Since he learned about Sumter's John and Jane Doe, Clemson resident Matthew McDaniel couldn't stop searching for answers.
I think it's probably the cold, calculated execution style type of murder that it was, and the fact that it was a couple, a man and a woman.
He's a volunteer with a passion for advocating for the voiceless. For 8 years, he's worked with Sumter investigators to track down leads and even created a website dedicated to the cold case.
Ever since I kind of started working that lead, I've kind of got the bug and obsessed with the case and kept going, kept investigating.
Now, he's helped create a DNA profile for Pamela Buckley and James Freund by getting their information entered into NamUs, a national resource center for missing, unidentified, and unclaimed person cases.
Paul James Freund was born on September the 19th, 1946, in Finchburg, Massachusetts. It wasn't before too long that his family relocated to Pennsylvania. James went to McCaskey High School, where he played football and baseball. They always did believe the whole time that he played contact sports, and that was indeed true. Immediately after high school, James enrolled in the U.S. Army, where in 1964 he took a 14-week class in auto mechanics. Hey, I'm not dissing that. You can learn a lot in 14 weeks. In December of 1964, James did indeed marry his high school sweetheart while serving overseas in Germany. And while overseas, James learned, unfortunately, that his dad died at the young age of 49 of a heart attack. In 1971, James gave birth to his first child. It was at this point that his marriage started to deteriorate, and later that year, he filed for divorce. Not a lot is known about James after his divorce in 1971. He was charged with non-payment of child support in 74, but those charges were later dropped. In December of 1975 was the last time that any of his family had contact with James. Now, Pamela Mae Buckley was born December 16th, 1951 in Redwood, Minnesota. She was a member of Spanish club and choir for most of her high school years. She had been nominated to become prom queen one year, and another year she'd been voted snow queen. She was set to become Miss Redwood Falls in 1971, but instead decided to go on tour with a local trio folk band named Sunlending. I mean, why would you not? In 1972, Pam married a local man from Colorado. She and her husband lived in Colorado Springs until she was reported missing. It seems that her and her husband had some kind of falling out, though none of the details are known. And the last time that she was seen was in December of 1975 as well. Her family reported her missing. Eventually, her husband did file for divorce. And crazy coincidence, the divorce was actually finalized 11 days after Pam was murdered. So let's take a look at a few of the theories that have been developed about this case. The main theory is that the couple was somehow involved in drug smuggling. Years later, it was revealed that drug smuggling had run rampant in the IMSA racing scene in that part of the country, and there were several racers that would go on to serve prison terms for smuggling and related charges. Some people tend to think that James was involved in drug smuggling and that Pam was just a victim of collateral damage. A lot of this theory hinges on the fact that James was wearing a IMSA racing t-shirt and the account of the KOA campground witness about the details of the couple's travels. So that t-shirt was actually sold only at one race that took place in March 1975 at the Sebring racetrack in Florida. Now, James could have gotten this shirt through many means. He could have been involved with the race to some degree as a fan or a vendor, but he also could have received it second-handed. Another theory is that our couple was the victims of a hitchhiker gone bad. They picked up a hitchhiker who had some bad intentions, maybe killed them and stole their car. There's a few folks who say that they were the hitchhikers who had been killed, but considering that they were clean and there was a few counts of them maybe having a vehicle, I personally believe this is not likely. Well, one thing we definitely know for sure is that Lonnie Henry Sr. was definitely involved somehow. Whether or not he committed the murders, I couldn't tell you for sure, but he knew who had access to that weapon, and there was things that he wasn't saying. But unfortunately, he died in 1982, and he took the secrets that he knew with the grave with him. Well, folks, I really hope you enjoyed this one today. Me and my pal Parrot really hope you did. If you have any tips at all for this investigation, please call the Sumter County Sheriff's Department at the number listed below. I'm sure they'd appreciate it. Thanks. Bye, y'all.